All right, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into one of the absolute greatest scientific mysteries of World War II. We're looking at why legendary physicist Werner Heisenberg and his top-tier team totally failed to build an atomic bomb for Nazi Germany. Now, for decades, this really fierce debate has been raging. Was this failure just straight-up technical incompetence? Was it a lack of resources? Or, and this is where it gets crazy, was it a deliberate moral choice, like some of the scientists themselves claimed later on? Well, today, we're going to unpack the evidence, look at these competing narratives, and really explore the fascinating psychology of brilliant minds caught in the massive machinery of war.
So, picture this. By July 1945, 10 of Germany's top nuclear experts, including Heisenberg himself, were detained at a British country house known as Farm Hall. But, this wasn't exactly some harsh prison. They were living incredibly comfortably. They had dedicated staff, daily newspapers, even subscriptions to physics journals. But here's the catch. They were completely isolated from the outside world, and they were totally oblivious to the fact that MI6 had bugged the entire building. Literally every casual conversation, every heated debate, every secret, it was all being recorded.
Then their comfortable little bubble was violently burst on August 6, 1945. When these captive scientists got the news that the Americans had successfully dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, their world just turned upside down. Up until that exact moment, these German experts were resting on this cozy illusion that German science was and always would be miles ahead of the rest of the world. The shock was absolutely profound. In fact, Otto Hahn, who was literally one of the original discoverers of nuclear fission, turned to Heisenberg, the architect of the German project, and bluntly told him he was just a second-rater. Just like that, the illusion of their scientific supremacy was completely shattered.
Section 1. The Moral Defense.
So how exactly do a group of the world's proudest scientists react when they realize they've been beaten in the single most consequential race in human history? Well, they construct a pretty fascinating defense. The very next day, August 7th, the scientists drafted and signed a collective statement. Now, on the surface, they claimed they couldn't build a bomb just because of Germany's technical constraints and because they had strategically shifted focus to building a reactor instead. But behind closed doors, a much bolder narrative was taking shape. Physicist Carl von Weizsäcker started arguing that the real reason they failed wasn't a lack of ability at all, but a lack of desire. They were basically claiming that, deep down, absolutely none of these physicists ever actually wanted to hand a weapon of mass destruction over to Adolf Hitler. They were painting themselves not as failed scientists, but as moral objectors.
Section 2. The Prosecution.
Unsurprisingly, this whole post-war narrative of moral superiority, it enraged a lot of people in the Allied camp. To them, the idea that these scientists who willingly worked for the Nazi regime were actually just secret pacifists all along, it was completely absurd. Enter Samuel Goodsmith. He was the scientific head of the Allied Alsos mission, which was tasked with uncovering the secrets of the German nuclear program. But you have to understand, for Goudsmit, this wasn't just a professional job, it was deeply, deeply personal. Goudsmit was a Jewish scientist who had actually known Heisenberg for 20 years. During the war, his elderly parents were trapped in The Hague. He had desperately reached out to Heisenberg, begging him to use his influence to save them. But he received what he felt was just this cold, perfunctory reply. Tragically, his parents were ultimately murdered in a Nazi gas chamber. So when Goodsmit heard Heisenberg's saintly self-defense after the war, he completely and utterly rejected it.
And this really perfectly illustrates the core historical conflict we're exploring today. You've got these two totally opposed views. On one side, Heisenberg's camp is insisting that they were constrained by wartime resources, sure, but ultimately driven by a deliberate moral choice not to build a bomb. Then, on the other side, Goldsmith is arguing that morality had absolutely nothing to do with it. He claimed a German failure was born purely out of scientific incompetence, intellectual arrogance, and just a severe lack of vision under a totalitarian regime.
And Goldsmith didn't just throw insults around. He actually brought the receipts. In his 1947 book, he completely tore down Heisenberg's defense by pointing out these glaring, massive technical oversights found right there in the German laboratories. For starters, the German team completely overlooked fast neutron fission, and even more shockingly, their experimental reactors lacked basic control rods and radiation protection. Those are fundamental requirements for a working reactor, let alone a bomb. Plus, they were just miles behind in isotope separation. For Goldsmith, these details proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the Germans simply did not understand how to actually build the bomb, regardless of whatever moral stances they claimed to have.
Section 3. The Military's True Verdict.
Okay, so while Heisenberg is claiming morality and Gautzschmidt is shouting incompetence, the actual historical record shows us that the real nail in the coffin came from a completely different direction. By the end of 1941, Hitler's blitzkrieg had violently stalled out, especially on the Eastern Front. The military apparatus was panicking. They demanded immediate, short-term results to win the war right then and there. They simply did not have the patience for theoretical physics that might pay off a decade later. So by June 1942, the German military basically ceased all major support for military nuclear research, completely shifting their resources to more immediate weapons, like the V-2 rockets.
And here's the real irony. The person who actually convinced the military to abandon the atomic bomb was Werner Heisenberg himself. Yep, in a crucial meeting in June 1942. Heisenberg gave this highly realistic, pretty unencouraging assessment to Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments. He basically told Speer that, hey, even if we get maximum support, building a bomb is still going to take years of development. Speer took one look at that timeline and immediately concluded that this project was absolutely not going to help them win the war anytime soon.
So the real deciding factor is perfectly captured by this staggeringly low number. Check this out. Out of over 2,200 recorded meetings that Albert Speer had with Adolf Hitler during the entire war, the topic of nuclear fission was only mentioned once. Just once. Think about that. While the Americans were out there funneling massive, unprecedented resources into the Manhattan Project, the Nazi leadership had entirely dismissed the atomic bomb as some wild fantasy that was just beyond their intellectual capacity to even grasp.
Section 4. Saving German Physics.
Which brings us to a really interesting question. If the military abandoned the project anyway, why did Heisenberg go to such incredible lengths to spin the truth after the war? Why concoct this whole narrative of being a secret resistor? Well, Heisenberg's primary post-war defense was that his cooperation with the Nazi regime was actually this calculated form of passive opposition. He argued that the only reason he stayed in Germany, taking these high-level positions and compromising with the authorities, was to protect the legacy, the very remnants of German physics. His mission, at least the way he framed it, was to make sure that German science could survive the war so it could be rebuilt once the dictatorship inevitably fell. He was essentially claiming he used the war to save physics, rather than using physics to serve the war. However, to the Allied scientists, and especially to the exiled Jewish scientists, this excuse was just repulsive. Nobel laureate James Franck stated bluntly that simply staying and working in Germany under that regime was an unforgivable crime in itself. To these exiles, it didn't matter what Heisenberg told himself to sleep at night. Defending an academic discipline, or just buying time, was never, ever a valid justification for compromising with a regime that was actively committing unspeakable atrocities. And Albert Einstein, who, remember, had once held the very same academic positions in Berlin that Heisenberg took over, was incredibly resolute in his judgment here. He sarcastically dismissed all of Heisenberg's post-war explanations as basically a masterclass in self-pity, literally labeling it a campaign for tears. For Einstein, Heisenberg and his colleagues showed this complete lack of real accountability. They were perfectly willing to complain about how hard they had it under the Nazis, but totally unwilling to show even a single trace of true guilt or remorse for their complicity.
Section 5. A Universal Dilemma.
Now, let's step back for a second from the hidden microphones at Farm Hall and the bitter post-war letters. Let's see how all of this builds into a much, much larger theme about the dawn of the atomic age. Because despite all the heavy criticism he faced, Heisenberg's post-war actions actually did align with his claims of wanting a peaceful future. As West Germany started to rebuild, Heisenberg used his considerable influence to successfully urge the new authorities not to pursue their own atomic weapons, arguing that NATO's nuclear umbrella was more than enough. He strictly pushed for nuclear technology to be used only for civilian power generation. So, in a way, he really was trying to ensure that German science would never, ever again be co-opted for mass destruction.
And when we impartially compare Heisenberg to his American counterpart, this really fascinating, kind of tragic parallel emerges. On one side, you have Werner Heisenberg, heavily scrutinized and branded a collaborator for working under a brutal dictatorship. But on the other side, you have J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the American bomb. Despite serving a democracy, and despite literally helping win the war, Oppenheimer also faced intense government suspicion. He had a security clearance revoked and was put on trial by the very same government he served. It reveals the shared underlying reality. Brilliant scientists inevitably become the hidden hands behind the slaughter, ultimately trapped by the governments that fund them.
As we wrap up this explainer on the Farm Hall mystery, it's clear the debate over Heisenberg's true intentions might literally never be fully resolved. Was he an incompetent scientist, a passive resistor, or simply a man caught in an impossible situation? I want to leave you with this final timeless question to think about. When governments harness the fundamental power of nature for destruction, and scientists are the ones providing the keys, in the pursuit of science during war, Is anyone truly innocent? Thanks so much for exploring this with me today, and keep questioning the history behind the science.